and today we are going to be reading some more of Resident Evil 0 Hour, wrote by S.D. Perry. We are currently on Chapter 3. If you enjoy the content, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, as we'll be doing this all of October, hopefully. Chapter 3. Rebecca watched as Billy stalked out of the train car, feeling impotent and very young. He didn't even look back, as though she wasn't worth worrying about. And apparently I'm not, she thought, her shoulders sagging. She hadn't expected him to be so, well, scary. Big, muscular, with dark, steely eyes, and intricate tribal tattoo covering his entire right arm. Both arms bared a thin cotton undershirt. He looked tough, and after her terrifying run-in with the walking near-dead, she hadn't been up to the task of taking him into custody. Not to mention, he got the drop on you. She'd found a lone corpse at the front of the car, one of the train workers, and had seen what looked like a key grasped in one cold hand. Since the only other door out of the car was locked, she'd had to try for it. It was that, or go back through the passenger car. She'd been so involved in trying to retrieve the key without snapping the stiff fingers that she hadn't heard the convict approaching. Not until it was too late. Now, as she walked back to the front of the car, she saw that the locked door used a card reader anyway. Great. So far, she was doing just great. She turned and reached for her radio, ready to admit defeat. If she could get the team in fast enough, they'd handle Billy. More important, she wouldn't be alone with the knowledge that some kind of plague had hit Raccoon. It was funny that nabbing a convicted killer was suddenly lower on the list of priorities. Bam! Bam! Before she'd even touched the transmitter button, she heard 2 rounds fire in the next car, the direction Billy had gone. She hesitated, not sure what to do. In that instant, a window exploded behind her. She spun, shards of glass flying, and saw a human figure falling to the floor. Edward! The mechanic didn't respond. Rebecca rushed to her teammate's side, quickly assessing his condition. Besides a massive, open wound on his right shoulder, his face was gray with shock, his gaze bleary and unfocused. Every exposed part of his body was covered with contusions and abrasions. "Are you all right?" she asked, ripping her medkit open. Grabbing a thick gauze patch, she tore the package apart, applied it to his shoulder, realizing with a sinking sensation that it might not do much good. From the massive amount of blood drenching his shirt, his subclavian had likely been severed. She was astounded that he was still alive, let alone that he'd had the strength to jump through a window. What happened? Edward rolled his head towards her, blinking slowly. His voice was taut with pain. "Worse than... we can't." She held the bandage firmly, but it was already soaked through. He needed a hospital ASAP, or he wasn't going to make it. Edward's voice was getting weaker. "You must be careful, Rebecca," he slurred. "Forest is full of zombies. And monsters." She started to tell him not to talk anymore, to conserve his energy, when more glass exploded, slivers of it raining over them. The window just to her left shattering. 2 giant dark shapes leaped through the broken pane, one disappearing around a jag in the corridor. The other turned in their direction. Zombies and monsters. A dog. It was a big dog, but not like no dog she'd ever seen before. It might have been a Doberman once, but as it bared dripping teeth at her, flaps of skin and muscle hanging from its haunches, she realized that it too had been infected by whatever disease had struck the train's passengers. It didn't just look dead, it looked destroyed. Its eyes filled with red, its body like some mad patchwork quilt of wet fur and bloody tissue. Edward wouldn't be able to protect himself, Rebecca slowly rose and took a step back from the dying mechanic, gun in hand, though she couldn't remember drawing it. She could hear the second dog panting further along the corridor, out of sight. She aimed for the animal's left eye, really understanding the true horror of the disease. Whatever it was, for the first time, her conflict was with the near-dead passengers had been terrible, but so shocking she'd hardly had time to consider what it all meant. Now looking at the stiff-legged, monstrous beast in front of her, its growl rising into a hellish whine of hunger, she remembered her childhood pet, a shaggy black lab mixed named Donner. Remembered how much she loved him, and understood that this probably had been someone's pet once, too, just as those people she'd shot had once been human, had laughed and cried and come from families that would miss them, that would be destroyed by their loss, disease, chemical spill, or attack. Whatever had caused all of this, it was an abomination. The understanding flashed through her mind in an instant and was gone. The dog tensed its shredded flanks, preparing to leap at her, and Rebecca squeezed the trigger, the 9mm rocking in her hands, the blast of sound deafening in the small space. The dog collapsed. Rebecca pivoted, aiming at the bit of a corridor she could see, waiting for the second to appear. She didn't have to wait long. With a snarl, the animal leaped around the corner, its jaws wide. Rebecca fired, the shot hitting its chest, staggering the dog back with a high whine of pain, but it was still on its feet. It shook itself as though shaking off water, growling, ready to come at her even as dark Icarus blood poured from its wound. Should have killed it. That should have knocked it flat. Just like the people in the passenger train car, it seemed that only a headshot would take it down. She raised her aim and fired again, this time hitting the center of its bullet-shaped skull. The dog fell, spasmed once, and went still. There could be more of them. She lowered the gun slightly, turning toward the broken windows and trying to see through the darkness and rain, straining to hear anything besides the storm. After a few beats, she gave up, kneeling next to Edward again, reaching into her pack for a fresh bandage, and stopped, staring at her teammate. The steady pump of blood from his shoulder wound was no more. She quickly felt for a pulse below his left ear, felt nothing at all. Edward gazed at the floor with half-open eyes, dead. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sitting back on her heels, it seemed inconceivable that he was gone, that he'd died in the short time she'd been shooting at the dog things, and a wash of guilt swept over her. If she'd been faster, if she'd packed his wound better. But you didn't, and the longer you sit here feeling bad about it, the more likely it is that you'll end up joining him. Get moving. Rebecca felt new guilt at the insensitive thought, but a glance at the open windows got her on her feet. She'd have to assess her culpability later, when it was safe to do so. Her radio beeped. She grabbed it, backing away from the windows from poor Edward. Reception was bad, but she could tell it was Enrico. She held the speaker to her ear, hugely relieved to hear the captain's strong voice in between bursts of static. "You copy? More information on Cohen." Rebecca reluctantly stepped closer to the windows, hoping to hear better, but the static barely lifted. "Institutionalized. Killed at least 23 people. Careful." "What?" Rebecca pressed the transmit button. "Enrico, this is Rebecca. Do you read me? Over." A wave of static. "Captain. Stars. Bravo. Do you copy?" Long seconds of more static. She'd lost the signal. Rebecca put the radio back on her belt. She had to get to the copter. Tell the others about Edward, about Billy, and the train, and the terrible danger they were all facing. She changed clips for the 9mm, taking a moment to reload the half-spent one. With a final sorrowful look at her fallen teammate, she stepped over a dog body, doing her best to avoid slipping in the pool of blood surrounding it, and started back toward the passenger car. Although she knew should be eager to run across the missing convict to arrest him, she hoped she wouldn't see Billy again. Edward's death, the dogs, she felt unsteady, incapable of taking charge. And 23 people, she shuddered, amazed that he hadn't killed her when he'd had the chance. In the passenger car, she saw the result of 2 shots she'd heard earlier. The disease victim she thought had moved, but hadn't been sure about. It seemed he'd been alive after all. He must have tried to attack Billy, the way the others had gone after her. She paused at the door back to the car she'd originally come through, looking over the decayed bodies of the people she'd killed. If Edward was right, if the woods were full of these things, she was going to have to move fast. And maybe Billy didn't kill those Marines. Rebecca blinked. It hadn't occurred to her earlier, but the Jeep may have been attacked, allowing Billy to escape, forcing him to run, in fact. It seemed likely. The 2 dead men had been mauled, not just shot. The dogs could have done it. She shook her head. It didn't matter. He was a killer, either way, and if she wasn't up to the job of apprehending him, she'd better go get someone who could. As serious as the unknown sickness was, they couldn't just let Cohen run. She left the passenger car behind, hurrying through the empty car to the side door, hoping that the others were all back at the helicopter, safe. She reached for the handle, lifted it. She wasn't sure how to break the news about Edward. That was going to be rough. Rebecca frowned, pushing at the sliding door, which was refusing to slide. She tried the handle again, and then kicked the door, cursing silently. It was stuck, or Billy had locked it, maybe to keep her from following him. Damn! She chewed at her lower lip, remembering that the key in the dead worker's hand. She hadn't managed to pull it free, and then had forgotten about it after her run-in with Billy. Not to mention Edward and the dogs. But then, who needed keys? She could just as easily crawl out through one of the broken windows. No big deal. She heard a sound, a door closing, and looked to her left, toward the back of the train. Someone was moving around in the next car over. Another 6-passenger? Probably. Or perhaps Billy was still on board. Either way, she was ready to get off, and she had her choice of windows to exit. Unless it's someone else back there. Someone who needs help. It could even be another of the STARS members. And now that she'd thought of it, she felt duty-bound to take a look, sensible or not. She walked quickly to the end of the empty car, readying herself for whatever would come next. It didn't seem possible that anything weirder could happen tonight, but then, most of what had already happened didn't seem possible. She wanted to be prepared for anything. She opened the door to the next car and took it in with a sweep of the 9mm, vastly relieved to find it empty and blood-free. There were stairs going up on the left, a door straight ahead. That must have been the door she'd heard closing. And now it opened, and out walked Billy Cohen. Scene change. Billy stopped, stared at the girl, at the weapon in her hand, and was glad that she was still alive, that she had a gun and apparently knew how to use it. After what he'd just learned, having a partner might be his only chance to survive. "This is bad," he said, and could see that she knew he wasn't referring to the gun in his face. She didn't answer, only watched him steadily, her 9mm unwavering, and he raised his hands, understanding that game time was over. The dangling handcuff slapped his wrist. "Those people, the ones you had to kill, they were sick," he said. "One of them tried to bite me. I shot him and found a notebook in his jacket. May I?" He started to lower one of his hands to reach for his back pocket. "No! Keep your hands up," she said, jerking the weapon. She still seemed scared, but was apparently prepared to arrest him. "Okay, fine," he said. "You get it. It's in my right back pocket." You're kidding, right? I'm not coming near you. Billy sighed. It's important. Some kind of diary. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Something about an investigation into a lab that's been abandoned or destroyed. But also talks about a bunch of murders that have happened around here. And the possibility that a virus has been released. Something called T-virus. He saw a spark of interest, but she was playing it safe. I'll read it after you put the handcuff back on, she said. He shook his head. Whatever's happening, it's dangerous. Someone locked all the exits. Have you noticed? Why don't we cooperate until we can get out of this? Cooperate? Her eyebrows rose. With you? He stepped closer, lowering his hands, ignoring the gun in his face. Listen, little girl. If you haven't noticed, there's some pretty freaked out shit on this train. I, for one, want to get out of here, and we don't stand a chance of doing it alone. She didn't lower the gun. You expect me to trust you? I don't need your help. I can handle this on my own, and don't call me little girl. She was starting to piss him off, but he reined it in. He didn't need her as an enemy. All right, Miss Do-It-Yourself, he said. What should I call you? The name is Rebecca Chambers, she said. That's Officer Chambers to you. Well then, Rebecca, why don't you tell me your plan of action? He asked. You gonna arrest me? Great, do it. Call the whole force in and tell 'em to bring heavy artillery. We can wait for them here. For the first time, she seemed to falter. Radio's out, she said. Hell, how'd you get here? He asked. Air or ground? How close is your transport? We came in by copter, but there was a malfunction, she said. Not that it's any of your business. Put the cuff back on. My team is waiting outside. Billy lowered his hand slowly. How far? Are you sure they're still around? The girl scowled. This isn't 20 questions, Lieutenant. I'm taking you out of here. Turn around and face the wall. No. Billy crossed his arms. Shoot me, if you have to, but there's no way I'm giving up my weapon or letting you cuff me. High color flared in her cheeks. You'll do what I tell you, or I'll... Crash! Windows breaking. In the upstairs compartment, Billy and Rebecca both looked up, then at each other. A few seconds later, they heard what sounded like heavy footsteps overhead. Slow and even. Then nothing at all. Dining room, Billy said, and it was empty a few minutes ago. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then lowered her weapon slightly. She moved to the foot of the stairs and looked up, her youthful face set with a determined expression. Wait here, she said. I'll check it out. Billy almost smiled. He'd been in special forces for 7 years, had learned how to shoot quite probably before she was out of grade school, and she was going to protect him. I thought you didn't trust me, he said. What's to stop me from climbing out of one of the windows and making my escape? The girl did smile, a small and cold affair. It's dangerous, remember? You don't stand a chance of doing it alone. Before he could come up with something properly snappy, she had turned her back and walked up the stairs, apparently determined to prove to him that she was a competent authority figure. Dumb kid. With all that was going on, proving herself shouldn't have been her top priority. He knew he shouldn't probably follow her. Keep her from getting herself... He should probably follow her, keeping her from getting herself killed, but he wanted a minute to think. He watched as she reached the top of the stairs and disappeared around a corner, not looking back. Like the song says, should I stay or should I go now? Rebecca wanted to arrest him, but that also meant she'd have to keep him alive, and she needed his help, no question. She was too inexperienced to be out here by herself. So who died and appointed you her personal savior? When are you gonna get it? You're not one of the good guys anymore, remember? Running still was out of the question, but he no longer felt so sure of his chances. If he'd needed more proof, that the woods were hazardous, the notebook he'd found, the pocket journal of the man who attacked him, was more than enough. He pulled it out, flipping to the last few entries, the one that had caught his eye. July 14th. We heard today about Arklay Lab, and we're being sent in to check it out next week. Some of the others are worried about the conditions, about what might be left. But like the boss says, someone's got to take the first look. Might as well be us. The writer went on to talk about his girlfriend, who'd be angry that he was leaving town. Billy skipped ahead, skimming the pages for what he'd read before. July 16th. There was still so much we don't know about responses to T-virus, depending on the species and environment. Only minute doses of T bring about remarkable changes in size, aggressive behavior, and brain development. In animals, anyway. Nothing's immune, but until the effects can be better controlled, the company's playing with fire. Billy turned the page. July 19th. The day is finally approaching. I'm more anxious than I thought I'd be. The Raccoon City newspapers and TV stations have been reporting bizarre murders in the suburbs. It can't be the virus, can it? If it is, no. I can't think of that now. I have to concentrate on the investigation, make sure it goes smoothly. Changes in size, aggressive behavior, brain development, like, say, in a dog? And that bit about in animals, anyway. What did this T-virus to do humans? Billy was willing to bet he'd already seen the results. Turns them into zombies, he muttered. Or as good as zombies, anyway. The one he'd shot had definitely been looking for lunch. What was it that cannibals called humans? Long pig. That was it. That walking mess had wanted some long pig, no question. Woods full of cannibals and monsters. He'd take his chances with the girl. She'd held her own so far, had killed at least 3 of the passengers, and managed to hang on to her sanity. He'd stay with her until they got out of this, and then he'd work out an escape before the rest of her team moved in, assuming there was any of her team left. A girl, the girl, screamed from overhead, a sound of pure terror. Billy grabbed his weapon and bolted up the stairs, 2 at a time, hoping he hadn't waited too long to make up his mind. Scene change. At the top of the stairs was a slight curve, then a door. Rebecca opened it slowly, carefully, with the muzzle of the handgun, and stepped inside. A thin, acrid haze of smoke greeted her, and the low flicker of fire, making shadows dance on the walls. It was a dining car, like Billy had said, and had once been beautiful. The tables covered in fine linen, the windows draped with cream-colored curtains. Now it was trashed, plates and broken glass everywhere, tables overturned, the linens soaked with spilled wine and blood, and near the back, a lone figure sat hunched over a table, the hem of the tablecloth burning, the flames licking upward. Rebecca saw a small oil lamp smashed in front of the table, the cause of the fire. The fire was still small, but it might not be for long. The man at the table was very still, and as Rebecca walked closer, she saw that he wasn't like the passengers below. Wasn't infected by what Billy had suggested was the T-virus. He was an older, distinguished-looking man in a brown suit, his white hair slicked back, his head bent over his chest as though he nodded off during dinner. Heart attack? Or had he passed out? It didn't seem likely he'd broken a second-story window and climbed inside, but as far as she could tell, there was no one else in the room, no one else who could have made those heavy footsteps they'd heard. Rebecca cleared her throat as she moved toward him. "Excuse me," she said, stopping next to the table, noticing his face and hands were wet, gleaming slightly in the firelight. "Sir?" No response, but he was breathing. She could see his chest moving. She leaned in, put her hand on his shoulder. Sir? He started to raise his head, turning his face toward her, and there was a sick, wet sound, like lips smacking over something slimy, and the man's head slid from his torso and toppled to the floor. The wet sound got louder. The decapitated body started to shake, to bubble with movement, as though filled with living things. Rebecca stumbled backward, letting out a scream as the man's body slid apart like badly stacked blocks, great pieces of it falling to the floor. When the pieces hit, they disintegrated, the cloth of the suit changing color, turning black, becoming many things, each the size of a fist. Slugs! They're like slugs. Slugs with rows of tiny teeth. Not slugs at all, but leeches, fat and round, and somehow able to mimic a man. Even the man's clothes. Not possible. This can't be happening. She stumbled back farther, sick with terror, as the individual creatures came together once more, melding into one another. The mass of abnormal, bloated things growing into a glistening tower of darkness. They reformed, took shape and color, and again became the old man she'd seen sitting at the table. She stared in shock, in disbelief, even knowing that he was made up of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the disgusting things. She couldn't see the spaces between them. Wouldn't have known that it wasn't a man except she'd seen it form for herself. The shade of the suit, the shape and the color of the body. The only clue that it wasn't a man was the strangely shining quality of its skin and clothes. It cocked its left arm back as though about to pitch a baseball, and then snapped forward. The arm elongated, stretched impossibly. Rebecca was at least 5 meters away, but the glistening wet hand swatted at the air only centimeters from her face. She tripped over her own feet in a hurry to get away, falling to the floor as the arm snapped back into place, then cocked backwards, ready to strike again. Gun, stupid, shoot! She jerked the weapon up and fired, the first 2 shots going wild, the third and fourth disappearing into this thing's lurching body. She could see the not flesh ripple when the bullets hit the suit, and the body beneath it undulating slightly, as though she were seeing it through the heat waves of asphalt on a summer day. The creature barely hesitated before whipping its arm toward her once more. She dodged, but the hand made contact, slapping against her left cheek. She screamed again, more from the feel of the hand than the strength of the blow. It was cold and slimy and rough, like shark skin dipped in pond scum. And before it withdrew, it slapped at her again, this time knocking the 9mm from her hand. The weapon skittered across the floor, ending up beneath one of the tables. The old man creature took another oddly lurching step, was now close enough that its next blow likely wouldn't be so easily evaded, and Rebecca just had time to think that she was dead. And bam, bam, bam! The creature was staggering back, and someone was firing again and again, the unexpected sound making her cringe as she staggered to her feet. The first few shots disappeared into its form like before, but the shooter kept at it, finding the monster's aged and shining face, its shining eyes. Dark liquid flew from the sudden opening in its collective, leeches blowing to pieces, and on the 6th or 7th shot, the man-thing began to melt back into its component parts. The small, black animals slithering toward the broken windows as they hit the floor. Rebecca looked back at the door and saw Billy Cohen standing there in a classic shooter's position, both hands on his weapon, his gaze fixed on the monstrosity in front of them, as it finished its silent collapse, becoming many once more. The leeches continued to make for the windows, sliding on trails of slime over the debris-littered floor, and up the stained walls, slipping effortlessly over the jagged edges of glass and into the storming night. They had finished their attack, it seemed. A strange, high, singeing drift in over the sound of the rain. Still in shock, Rebecca walked to the window carefully, avoiding the remaining leeches as they streamed out of the car, retrieving her weapon before looking out to find the source of the singing. Billy joined her, making no effort to step over the strange creatures. Several popped wetly beneath his boot heels. In a flash of lightning, they saw him standing on a low hill west of the train, a lone figure, male, from his height, from the width of his shoulders, raised long arms, a gesture of welcome, and sang in a surprisingly sweet soprano, his voice young and rich and strong, Latin, like something from church. As if that weren't bizarre enough, he seemed to be standing in a low, shallow lake, the ground rippling slightly all around him. It was too dark to see well, only deep shadow and silhouette marking the lonely singer. "Oh, Christ," Billy said. "Look at that." Rebecca felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle, her mouth turning down in a grimace of disgust. There was no lake. The ground was covered with leeches, thousands of them, all moving toward the singing young man. She could see the hem of his long coat or robe flapping as the creatures flowed upward, disappearing beneath it. "Who is that guy?" Billy asked, and Rebecca shook her head. "Maybe like the old man made from the creatures." The train lurched suddenly. A rising, heavy mechanical sound filled the car, the floor vibrating beneath their feet, and then the train was moving, slowly at first, quickly picking up speed. She looked at Billy, saw the same confused surprise on his face that she knew she wore, and for the first time felt something besides angry disdain for the criminal. He was stuck in this nightmare, same as she was. And he did just save my life. "Still handling things yourself?" he asked, smirking, and she felt the tenuous bond between them disappear. Before she could say anything, though, he seemed to realize that his passive-aggressive stab at humor wasn't what the situation called for. "I think we could both use a little help here," he said. "How about it? Just until we're out of this, all right?" Rebecca thought about the viral victims she'd seen, those she'd killed, about what Edward had said, that the woods were full of zombies and monsters. She thought about the man made of leeches, and their strange, singing master out in the rain, and finally about the fact that someone or something had started the train. Even if Enrico and the rest of the team were still alive, they were falling farther and farther away by the minute. "Yeah, okay," she said, and though his grim and arrogant demeanor didn't change, she thought that Billy was relieved, and she knew that she was. Chapter 4. The solitary figure on the hill watched as the train gathered speed and disappeared into the storm, his heart full of the song that spilled from his lips, that rang so sweetly through the wild air, calling his minions back to him. They had done well, readying the train for the inevitable cleanup crew as soon as the sun had gone down, leading most of the infected away through the woods, locking the doors, powering the engine. He wanted the leeches to feed, not the virus carriers, and once the Umbrella team boarded, there would be no escape. The rain washed over the many as they crept up the hill, beckoned by his voice, by his desires. He received them with a smile as he finished his song. All was going as well as he might have wished. After so long a wait, it wouldn't be long now. He would fulfill his dream. He would become Umbrella's nightmare, and then the world. Scene change. We need to stop this train first thing, Rebecca said. Billy nodded. Any suggestions? We split up, she said calmly, surprisingly calmly, considering what she'd just been through. The car at the front of the train is locked, where we met. We need to get that door open to get to the engine. So we shoot the lock, Billy said. Rebecca shook her head. Magnetic card reader. We have to find a key card. I saw a conductor's office. Locked. Rebecca said, we'll have to dig up one ourselves. That could take a while, Billy said. We should stick together. It'll take us twice as long, and I'd rather get off this thing before it ends up wherever it's going. As much as he didn't want to wander the train alone, didn't want her to wander it alone, he couldn't argue with that logic. I'll start at the back, work forward, she said. You take the second floor, we'll meet at the front. Bossy little thing, aren't you? He thought, but kept it to himself. At some point in the not too distant future, she might be the only thing keeping him from becoming somebody's lunch. And I will shoot if you try anything funny, she added. Billy started to snap back at her, then saw the shine in her eyes. She wasn't serious. Not entirely. She nodded at his weapon. You need ammo for that thing? I'm good, he said. You? Another nod, and she started for the door. When she reached it, she turned back. Thanks, she said, motioning vaguely toward the back of the car. I owe you. Before he could answer, she was gone. Billy stared after her a moment, somewhat amazed by her willingness to face the train's dangers on her own. Had he been so brave when he was her age? It's called denial of mortality when you're that young, he thought. Yeah, he'd thought he'd live forever then too. Being sentenced to death made one take a slightly different view on things. He spent a brief moment checking the dining car, scowling at the mashed and liquid remains of a few dozen leech things as he hurriedly checked behind the small bar beneath the tables. There was a locked door at the front of the room, but a swift kick and a glance showed him an empty service cabin with a hole in the roof. He didn't linger, figuring their best bet would be searching the bodies of the train workers anyway. He headed down the stairs, pausing at the bottom of a moment, looking toward the rear of the train before continuing on. Rebecca Chambers seemed capable of taking care of herself. Better if he watched his own ass. Back through the double doors, through the first passenger car, still empty, and a deep breath before heading into the second. A quick look to make sure there wasn't anyone walking around, and he headed up the stairs, not wanting to look at the body of the man he'd killed. He'd killed before, but it was never something he got used to. Not if you had a conscience. The smell hit him before he reached the second floor, and he slowed, breathing shallowly, like sea water and rot. When he got to the top, he saw the source and swallowed back bile. Now we know where they came from. He stepped onto a landing at the top of the stairs, one that turned into a corridor to his immediate right, turning right again, a few meters ahead, and from the floor to the ceiling. The corner of the landing to his left was webbed with what appeared to be hundreds of empty egg sacs, creating something like a spider's nest. Only these sacs were black and wet, shining in the low light of a half-buried wall sconce. They swayed slightly as the train rocked back and forth on the track, making them appear almost alive. At least they were empty. He hoped to God he wouldn't run into whatever had laid them. He edged away from the webbed corner, stepping on strings of glistening matter that spread across the hall's fine carpet, vaguely wondering if the Jeep accident had been such a blessing, after all. He didn't want to die in any manner, but a nice, clean firing squad beat the shit out of being devoured by shape-changing leeches. Knock it off, soldier. Be aware. Be where you are. Right. He walked the corridor, relaxing slightly. Once he realized it was empty, there were two closed cabin doors, one on each side of the narrow passage, each marked by a number. From that and the hall's luxurious decor, he guessed they were private cabins. It was a good guess. He pushed open the first door, 102nd, and found a small bedroom, well appointed and thankfully free of blood and bodies. Unfortunately, there wasn't much else, either, though he did find a clutter of personal belongings in the tiny closet. There were papers, a clutch of photographs, and jewelry box. He opened the box, revealing a silver ring, unusual in design. It looked like a single part of one of those interlocking ring sets, notched and warped in a distinct pattern. And since he wasn't jewelry shopping, he put it back, heading out to the next cabin. When he opened the door to 101, he felt a rush of hope. There, lying on the floor like a gift, was a shotgun. Billy scooped it up and cracked it, his hope turning to a guarded happiness. It was a Western over-under loaded with two 12-gauge shells. Further searching turned up another handful of shells, though no keycard. Magnetic lock or no, this'll probably open that door, he thought, comforted by the weight of the heavy weapon as he stuffed the shells into his front pocket. He was tempted to go find Rebecca immediately, but decided he might as well finish what he'd started. There was a door at the end of the hall, presumably leading to the next car's second floor, and it would lead him closer to the front of the train. Anyway, the sooner to reunite with the kid. He wasn't scared to be on his own. It wasn't that, and it wasn't even concern for Rebecca, though that was there too. It was too many years spent in service. If he'd learned anything, it was that being alone in combat was the worst way to be. The door was unlocked and opened into an empty lounge car, an extremely snazzy one. There was a polished wooden bar to his right, well stocked, and small, elegant tables lined either wall, leaving the wide, expensively carpeted floor beneath the low-hanging chandeliers. Like the last car, no blood or bodies. Billy checked the counters behind the bar, then headed for the door at the far end, feeling strangely ill at ease, crossing the open space. He clutched the heavy shotgun firmly. When he was almost across the room, something crashed onto the roof. The sound was thunderous, huge. The impact so strong that a chandelier back by the bar hit the floor, the glass globes shattering. The train car rocked on its rails, causing him to stumble, almost fall. He kept his feet, turning to look where the chandelier had fallen. The roof was actually indented. The thick metal twisted out of the shape, and as he watched two giant things pierced through about 2 meters apart, one after the other. Billy stared, not sure what he was seeing. Big, pointed, cylindrical, each piercing piece appeared to be bisected, split down the middle. They looked like claws. His gut nodded. That was exactly what they were, like a giant crab's or scorpion's claws, and as he watched, they both opened, revealing thickly serrated edges. The huge pincers turned inward and up, began to actually saw through the steel roof, the sound of ripping metal like a high scream. He'd seen enough. He turned and ran the last few meters to the door out, aware that he'd broken out in a cold sweat. Behind him, the scream of tortured metal went on, and he grabbed the handle, jerked, and it was locked. Of course. He spun back just in time to see the owner of the massive pincers jump down through the jagged entrance it had made, blocking the only other means of escape. Scene change. Rebecca had just decided the last car was safe when the dog attacked. After leaving Billy, she'd made her way through a kitchen area in the last car, one awash in blood and fallen cookware, but otherwise empty. She was starting to wonder if some of the passengers and crew might have gotten off. Perhaps when the train had first been attacked, there was a lot of blood around for so few bodies. Considering the state of the few passengers she'd run into, maybe that was for the best. Her feet skidded through a puddle of cooking oil as she surveyed the kitchen, but her search was otherwise uneventful. The door to the rest of the car, presumably a storage area of some kind, was locked, but there was a crawl space that ran beneath the floor. With a covering she managed to pry up without too much trouble. She wasn't happy about having to crawl into a dark hole, but it was a short tunnel, just a couple meters. Besides, she'd told Billy she would start at the back of the train, and she meant to be thorough. Doing a decent job was something to hold on to in the midst of such madness. The virus victims were bad enough, and that man made out of leeches. Don't think about it. Find the key card, stop the train, go get some real help. Someone besides a convicted killer, thank you very much. Billy was her only port in the storm, so to speak, and he'd certainly saved her ass. But trusting him any further than she absolutely had to would be idiotic. She'd been right about the next compartment. After a thankfully brief, claustrophobic crawl, she stood up in a storage space, barely lit by a single hanging bulb. There were boxes and bins along the walls, mostly hidden in deep shadow. She swept the darkness with her weapon. Nothing moved but the train itself, rocking along the track. At the back of the compartment was a door with a window in it. Rebecca stepped closer, 9mm extended, saw darkness and movement on the other side. The sound of the train louder, and realized she was actually in the last car. Looking out over the track, she felt a flutter of something like relief, just knowing that the world still existed out there, and that if worse came to worse, she could always jump. The train was going pretty fast, but it was an option. Click. She spun at the soft sound behind her, heart hammering, aiming at nothing. The train kept rolling along, the shadows pitching and swaying. The sound not repeated. After a tense moment, she took a deep breath, blew it out. Probably one of the boxes shifting, like the rest of this car. Well, the first floor, anyway. The storage compartment seemed to be safe. She doubted there'd be a keyboard floating around, but at least she could say she looked. Click, 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 click. Rebecca froze. The sound was right next to her, and she knew what it was. Anyone who'd ever had a dog would know. The tick of toenails on a hard surface. She slowly turned her head to the right, to where she now saw there was a couple of dog carriers, both with their doors standing open, and emerging from the shadows behind the closet closest. It all happened so fast. With a vicious snarl, the dog leaped. She had time to register that it was like others she'd seen, huge, infected, damaged. And then her right foot came up, the action reflexive. She kicked out hard and caught one side of the creature's barrel chest with her heel. With a horrible, wet, tearing sound she'd heard, as well as felt a sizable flap of the animal's chest slow away, the skin sliding off the graying muscle, the wet and matted fur sticking to the bottom of her oily shoe. Incredibly, the dog ignored the wound and kept coming, its jaws wide and dripping. It would have her before she could get to the gun up. She knew it. She could already feel the teeth clamping on her arm, and she also knew that a bite from this dog would kill her, would turn her into one of the walking near-dead. Before the teeth actually touched, her other foot, slick with oil, skidded out from beneath her. Rebecca hit the floor, banging her hip, and the dog flew overhead, a smell like rotten meat washing over her. It actually stepped on her, one back paw smearing dirt on her left shoulder as it bounded over her, the momentum of its lunge carrying it past. The wildly lucky fall only bought her a second. She rolled onto her stomach, extended her arm, and fired. catching the animal as it turned to lunge again. The first shot went high. The second found its mark, just below the poor beast's left eye. The dog sagged to the floor, dead before it had stopped moving. Blood began to spread around the fallen dog, and Rebecca scrambled away, pushing herself to her feet. Beyond the very basics, virology wasn't her specialty, but she was willing to bet that the dog's blood was hot, highly infective, and she wasn't interested in catching whatever was going around. This wasn't a common head cold. Assuming this is a virus, she thought. Staring down at the decayed mess that had been a canine, it made as much sense as anything. The mysterious T-virus Billy had talked about, how had it spread? What was the rate of toxicity? How quickly did it amplify once inside a host body? She scraped the sole of her shoe against one of the kennels, hoping that she'd be able to erase that wet dripping sound from her memory as easily, and saw something glitter from shadows. She leaned down to pick up a small gold ring, notched in an unusual design. It didn't appear to be real gold, was probably worthless, but it was pretty, and she was lucky to be standing there, looking at it, all things considered. Which makes this a lucky ring, she said, and slipped in on her left index finger. It was very nearly a perfect fit. The ring was all she found. There was no key card lying around, nothing useful. She stepped out onto the back platform for a moment and was instantly drenched. The storm was torrential, and the train was moving much too quickly to consider jumping. Her hopes soared briefly when she saw a panel labeled Emergency Brake Line, but a few taps at the controls proved it to be powerless. So much for emergencies. She went back inside, pushing her wet hair off her forehead. Time to head forward. Try searching the bodies of the men that she and Billy had killed. As distasteful as the thought was, there wasn't much of an alternative. They didn't know if anyone was driving the train, or if it was a runaway either. They needed to get control. She looked back at the dog one more time before leaving by the door this time, thinking of how lucky she'd been, how easily she could have been bitten or mauled to death. No way would she let her guard down again. She only hoped Billy was having better luck. Scene change. Christ on a cross. Billy stared, his mouth hanging open, his mind numb with the impossibility of the thing not 10 meters in front of him. It might have looked something like a scorpion, if scorpions grew as big as sports cars. The monster that fell through the train's roof was insectile, maybe 3 meters long, with a pair of giant armor claws snapping around its flat face, a long, bloated tail that curved up over its back, that ended in a curled stinger bigger than Billy's head. There were multiple legs, but Billy wasn't in a counting mood. Not with the thing moving toward him, emitting a sound like an overheated engine as its massive jointed legs pounded across the floor. Rain poured down from the hole in the roof, making the scene all the more hellish. The creature emerging from the wet haze like a bad dream. No time to think. Billy shouldered and cocked the hunting gun and aimed for the thing's low, flat skull. Between the motion of the train and the monstrosity's loping scrabble, it took him a few seconds to be sure of the shot, a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. The creature scrambled closer, its stiffly haired feet gouging up flaps of the expensive carpet with each rumbling step. Billy squeezed. Boom! The shotgun slapping against his shoulder, hard enough to bruise. A hit, and the thing screeched, a splash of milky fluid erupting from the plated skull. He didn't pause to assess damage, only re-aimed and fired again. Boom! The thing was screeching ever louder, but still coming. Billy broke the shotgun, jerked the empty shells out, dug for more. He fumbled, shells spilling to the carpet, the shrieking monster closing the distance fast, too fast. There was a single shell left in his pocket. He got it out, jammed it home, and brought the rifle up to his hip, This better be the one. The shot hit the monster's square center of its dark, ugly face, only a meter from where Billy stood, close enough that he felt the heat of gunpowder residue hitting his bare skin, embedding there. Its screech died as a large, jagged chunk of exoskeleton blew out the back of its head, splattering the spasming tail with blood and brain matter. It shivered all over, its huge claws whipping outward, opening and closing, its stinger jabbing at air. With a final gurgling cry, it sank to the floor, seeming to deflate as its heavy claws, its body, came to rest. The smell of it, the dirt and hot, sour grease, was nearly overwhelming. But Billy didn't move for a full minute, wanting to be sure it was dead. He could see where the first 2 rounds had hit. The shotgun pulled slightly to the left, though the final shot had been dead on, chipping away at the thick armor that shaded its beady eyes. What is that? What is it? He stared down at the horror, not sure he wanted to know. It had to be connected to the dogs and Walking Dead, to the T-virus. That journal he'd found had said something about even small doses causing changes in size and aggressiveness, which means this guy must have snorted a couple of gallons minimum, accidentally. No chance. The journal also said something about a laboratory and controlling the effects of the virus, about how, until they could control it, the company was playing with fire. The implications were clear enough. Maybe the T-virus had gotten out by accident, but this company, whatever it was, had obviously known that it could do beforehand, had experimented with it. For the moment, though, all that mattered was that it was dead, and he was done searching for any keycard. Screw going it alone. If the Scorpion King had any brothers or sisters wandering around, Billy wanted someone else to take up the slack. He picked up the shells he'd dropped and reloaded. Then he carefully stepped around the massive, stinking carcass and set off to find Rebecca. Maybe she'd had better luck than he had. Scene break. Just after she stepped into the front car, Rebecca thought she heard weapon fire. From back the way she came, she stood in the doorway, holding on to the frame, staring blankly at the one dead dog visible from her position as she strained to hear. Thunder rumbled outside. After a moment, she gave up and walked toward the front of the train. She moved slowly, steeling herself to see Edward again, wishing she'd thought to grab a blanket or something from the mess back in the passenger's car. Maybe a coat off one of the dead men. She certainly hadn't gotten anything else, except a rising sense of indignation with whoever had loosed the T-virus, and a headache from holding her breath. No keys, nothing to help. That train worker's body at the front of the car where she'd met Billy, though. Perhaps the key in its dead hand would turn out to be useful somehow. She reached the turn in the corridor and forced herself past it, skirting the pool of fluids that had leaked from the dog, and Edward was gone. Rebecca stopped, stared. The second dog was still there, but a wad of red gauze and a few bloody splatters were all that remained where Edward's body had been. That and the thick smell of rot. Cool, wet air breezed in through the windows, but the smell was too strong for it. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as she looked down, saw the tracks in the dog blood. She followed them with her gaze toward the front, seeing the boot prints in red smeared as though whoever had worn them was drunk or sick. No, she'd felt for a pulse. Time slowed even more. Her gaze finally rising from the floor, she saw the edge of a bare arm. Someone standing just out of sight at the end of the hall. Someone tall. Someone wearing the boots. No, she said, and Edward stepped away from the wall, stepped into view. When he saw her, his bloodless lips opened, a moan emerging. He staggered toward her, his face gray, his eyes filmed, almost white. Edward? He kept walking, reeling, his blood-drenched shoulder trailing along the wall, his arms slack at his sides, his face empty and mindless. This was Edward. This was her buddy, and she raised her handgun, taking a step back, taking aim. "Don't make me," she said, a part of her mind wondering at how deathlike the virus made its victim seem. Must have slowed his heart rate. Edward moaned again. He sounded desperately hungry, and though his eyes were barely visible through the haze of white, he could see them well enough to understand that this wasn't Edward anymore. He staggered closer. "Be at peace," she whispered, and shot him, the round drilling a neat hole in his left temple. He stood perfectly still for a beat, his expression of dull hunger unchanging, and then collapsed to the floor. Rebecca was still standing there, aiming at the corpse of her friend, when Billy found her a few minutes later. Alrighty, that is going to be it for Chapter 4. Thank you all so very much for checking out the Haze Demon Show. If you enjoy my reading of the Resident Evil books, please let me know. I will be continuing to do this for quite a good while. I've been wanting to read these books, and it's pretty exciting to get back into it. So I hope you enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Don't forget to bring a towel. Peace out.
You wanna know how I got these scars?
Shut up, Mimsy!